Hello, my name's Nat Jones. I'm an occupational therapist and a clinical academic researcher. And I want to share today some points about the role of occupational therapy in stroke rehabilitation and also about my research, which I've been doing for the last 8 years, which is mainly around eating and drinking difficulties after stroke. So, the role of occupational therapy with people who have eating and drinking difficulties takes a number of approaches. The first part is around assessment, so identifying the physical barriers that people experience with eating and drinking difficulties, and alongside that, understanding the psychosocial support that people require. And in with that, enabling people to be as independent as possible with approaches that support dignity and help people manage anxiety around eating and drinking difficulties. And typical interventions might include using adaptive cutlery, equipment, and compensatory strategies. So, in terms of assessment, we would be really focused on the impact on that individual and the particular barriers that they experience. So, we want to have a good understanding of what their performance is like. So, observation of eating and drinking in action. We'd also want to look at the environment that people are working in and understand what difficulties the environment might be presenting for them. Once we've completed an assessment to understand the difficulties and the impact on the individual, we then move on to look at the interventions available. So those interventions might be about providing assistive devices, equipment. They might be about looking at strategies, compensatory strategies to enable people to be as independent as possible. It would definitely be liaising with other members of the multidisciplinary team, physiotherapy, nursing, speech and language therapy, as everyone has a part to play in supporting eating and drinking, good nutrition and hydration. Next, we would also be focused on the psychosocial impact of eating and drinking difficulties. So we'd be interested in how it affects people's ability to participate in everyday activities and how it might be affecting nutrition and hydration, particularly in hospital. And we'd also be interested in the sort of social aspect of dining and the cultural aspects. And within that process of assessment and then looking at intervention options, there would be some goal setting and rehabilitation. So the goal setting will be on meaningful goals. We might start with grading activities so people can achieve, first of all, a little bit in terms of independence and then gradually build up as they gain confidence for them to be more independent with eating and drinking. So I started to look at eating and drinking difficulties post-stroke around 8 years ago. My first research study, I wanted to understand this complex area of practice in stroke rehabilitation and identify what were people doing, how were they adapting, what assistive devices were they utilising, and how were they being supported. And that became the focus of the first study. Now, the first study that I did, I decided to use participatory design methods, particularly using photography, which is known as a cultural probing approach to research. So, cultural probing involves using artifacts such as photos to facilitate discussion and engage participants within the research. So I gave stroke survivors their own disposable cameras, and they went about their daily lives and they photographed their lived experience of eating and drinking difficulties. And this helped me to understand the real life experiences, provided insights into their personal eating and drinking experiences, and really enabled me to see things that I wouldn't have normally seen as a researcher. So when I got the photographs developed, we started to look at the photographs, and people had photographed a whole array of places that they had visited for eating and drinking with family and friends. And as you would imagine, there was a lot of pubs that had been photographed, and the particular barriers around eating out. Stroke survivors also photographed their life at home. So some stroke survivors talked about difficulties with preparing food after stroke and having to move to more sort of ready meals, and how this particularly introduced more processed food into their diet, and offering that convenience, but also not so good on the sort of nutritional side of things. They also photographed their aids that they used at home and their kitchen environments and some of the barriers of being able to cook. So it was great to see that sort of lived experience perspective. One lady photographed a whole series of pictures of making breakfast and how challenging that was for her one-handed, and the difficulties that she had with packaging. And some stroke survivors photographed things and talked about their experiences. For example, sensory changes after stroke and how they'd burnt themselves and not realised when they were cooking meals. And patients also talked about visual changes after stroke and perceptual deficits, which meant that they didn't see food on the plate. So, by discussing the photographs, it brought out a whole array of issues that people were experiencing. So, stroke survivors, despite all of these difficulties, talked about striving for mastery, and they really wanted to achieve normal life, get back to how things were before. And despite all of the impairments, they were really striving for normal, getting back to normal eating and drinking. And this was achieved through learning from experience, testing out things themselves, learning from others, and being able to problem solve around difficulties and barriers that they experienced. And they also talked about practical strategies and equipment that they'd perhaps bought and tried and wasn't helpful. So it was gathering just at the back of the cupboard, or things that they'd really found helpful. They photographed a lot of different assistive devices, and they talked about the difficulties with one-handed cooking, difficulties peeling fruit, cracking eggs, getting the fork, um, as they were unable to have a knife. One patient photographed the rocker knife for cutting sort of firmer, heavier foods. Here we've also got a photograph of a stroke survivor. We're using a vegetable board to impale the veg on to make it easier to peel. What one really interesting finding from the study was about how stroke survivors were hacking everyday objects. So, hacking is a term that designers use to explain a method in product design where everyday people become their own um, problem solver and designer, and they adapt the things that they already have, taking everyday objects and resources available to enhance design or individualize items for personal use. And what we saw was that patients talked about Here, one patient talked about using a grapefruit spoon because it had the deeper side, so they found it easier to use as food didn't fall off the spoon when they were taking it up to their mouth. Another patient talked about using pasta bowls instead of plates because of the graded the sides to the bowl. So what was really interesting was this idea of customization. So quite a few people talked about the stigma attached to everyday living aids and also the design of them. They're quite, to be fair, they are quite ugly looking and they're not very pleasant. And a lot of people talked about like special cutlery that they'd had as wedding gifts or presents that they wanted to keep using. So they wanted to sort of use their everyday objects that they've got, and this is where the hacking idea came about, is how can you adapt it? Now, Norman discusses this need for human beings to modify and customize products to meet individual need and suggests that everyone is a potential designer. And customizing objects is seen as an important part of doing something very personal. And this process of adapting what you've already got helps to bond with an object and makes it more likely for you to use it. And there's more pleasure associated with something that you have adapted. When we think about this, we think about sort of the idea, the concept of glasses. So many years ago, everybody had, there was just like one or two sets of glasses that you would have. They were called national health glasses, and everybody had the same design. And over the years, we've seen that glasses, although a medical device to all extent and purposes, is now being modified for personal preference. And there are many, many different types of and colours of glasses available when you go to the opticians. So this idea is called resonant design, and this is the resonant design talks about the process of personalising objects to meet individual needs. And this is where stroke survivors had started to do that. So using pipe lagging or the foam from hair rollers to push onto toothbrushes and cutlery devices to make the handle better to grip, but they were then able to continue to use their own cutlery. So the outcome of this first study really gave a good overall view of eating and drinking difficulties and their impact. So you've got the motor impact of stroke and how that affects the upper limbs, the posture, and things that impact eating and drinking difficulties. You've got the psychological and the social aspects of the impacts and the sensory function, which can be impaired, which can affect eating and drinking difficulties. Obviously, the cognitive function as well. And then the emotional impact of all of these things brought together. So I was able to describe in the research this spectrum of eating and drinking tasks, which starts with sourcing the food in a supermarket and then looking at being able to access that food, access the packaging. Some people were buying things that they couldn't access once they got them home, and then the whole preparing of food and the difficulties around that before we even get to the sort of eating and drinking aspects. And this work has been published in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy. So I then went on from this research to do some more investigation around patient and public experience of eating and drinking difficulties. And I worked with stroke survivors in their own homes. And they were telling me there were not enough opportunities to practice eating and drinking strategies when they were in the early stages of stroke recovery. And they also told me about the experiences of being embarrassed and ashamed of their difficulties and their change in eating habits and how this had prevented them socialising with family and friends. I then went to seven stroke units in four counties and I talked to the healthcare professionals in the stroke services, and they all said we feel like we could do more to deliver more intense eating and drinking rehabilitation, but obviously constraints of resources play a big part in what they can actually do. And then they talked about the lack of integrated working. So quite a few people said the same thing in different variant ways. And what they said was eating and drinking is everybody's business, every healthcare professional's business. We all have a part to play. But what we don't do is work together on this very well as a collective. So this work really influenced the next study that I did which was part of my PhD research, which brought me to breakfast group interventions in stroke rehabilitation, the BSTRO study. So the primary aim of the study was to design and test a structured breakfast group intervention and implementation toolkit to improve the delivery of eating and drinking rehabilitation in stroke services. And there were three objectives to this work. First of all, to review existing evidence and theory related to post-stroke eating and drinking difficulties. And as there was quite a bit of research around this, I focused particularly on the psychosocial aspects of eating and drinking difficulties. And then to co-design a prototype breakfast group intervention with key stakeholders, so patients, family, and NHS staff, and then pilot and refine the intervention in three stroke services to assess for acceptability, applicability, and feasibility. So, first of all, what did the research say about the psychosocial impacts of eating and drinking difficulties? Well, there was no one article or paper that really gave a good overview of that. So, I decided to do a systematic review. So, I found 22 papers and I was able to interrogate the data within those papers to have a better understanding of the psychosocial impact of eating and drinking difficulties. So the psychological themes were experience of loss. So the feelings of grief and sadness related to the loss of eating and drinking abilities, changes in eating and drinking habits, and was a massive factor. um, a lot of evidence around fear and panic associated with these difficulties, particularly around fear of choking and swallowing difficulties. And then embarrassment and shame. And that was pretty core across all of the papers that I reviewed, is that there's a strong sense of shame and embarrassment associated with these difficulties. And from a social perspective, there was slightly less evidence of this, but a lot of the papers talked about social isolation and how, as a result of eating and drinking difficulties, people were socially isolating themselves by choice, so avoidance of social participation. They also talked about, despite all of these difficulties, wanting to get back to some normality and striving to be able to social dine with family and friends. And finally, this really strong emphasis on wanting to resume what was normal to people. So that was the first piece of research. The next piece of research that I did was a qualitative inquiry, and the results of this were used to go on and develop the intervention. Again, this has been published. So what I did was participant observations of stroke survivors in two stroke wards at breakfast time, to really get an understand of the lived experience of being on a ward and eating and drinking difficulties. I had 29 participants for this study, 13 patients and 14 staff members. And then following this, I went on to conduct with a different set of patients semi-structured interviews. So I had two patients, one carer, and two NHS staff. And so a really, really deep dive into lived experiences and the experience of hospital rehabilitation as well. And the results of that study have also, have also been published. I then went on to create some what I call trigger films. So um, I put a reference for this on the bottom of the slide, but the use of trigger films in research has become more popular recently, particularly around complex intervention design. So the idea is that you interview people about their lived experiences, you film that. I also did an analysis of the data from those films, but I also used clips of the films to create three mini films that were around the experience of eating and drinking, and those films were shown to key stakeholders who were helping me to develop the intervention. So the films triggered conversation, triggered experiences and thoughts, and that's how they were used. So I'm now going to go on and play one of the films. It's very short, a couple of minutes. I just want you to hear what the occupational therapist has got to say. Why is eating and drinking important to you?
I think eating and drinking is such a central part in our lives, who we are, how we interact with other people. Often eating and drinking is such a social thing, from who we sit and have breakfast with, or meeting our work friends at lunchtime, or going out for a drink after work. And on another level, I think preparing food for other people is often a sign of love. We can do that for our loved ones, and when there's a change and we can't do that, it's almost like an impact on our role. So I think eating and drinking for everybody is a big deal. It's a massive part of who we are.
What are your thoughts of mealtime groups?
I think they're excellent. So recently in Rotherham, I was lucky enough to sort of join a group that's been run before. And wow, as an OT, it just lit me up, and it lit all the staff up. So it was a small group because we had to think about COVID. They had the tablecloth on the table, they had the napkins folded a certain way, they had the butter and the spreads in little glass containers. And when I walked into the room, I just had a real sense of being taken care of. Someone's taken the time to make this beautiful and homely and normal. And the patients that came in, the way they interacted with each other was almost like they'd come from being a patient in bed to being a person again. We talked about holidays, and while the speech therapist is looking at what they could swallow and how they're doing that, there was also this beautiful interaction going on with patients and staff, where the patient status had gone away and we were people talking, and I thought that was magic.
So those trigger videos were really valuable within the research to get people talking about the difficulties they experienced, or the difficulties they observed stroke survivors experiencing, and inform thinking around what sort of interventions would be suitable to address some of these difficulties. So what are breakfast groups? Well, breakfast groups bring together stroke survivors to make breakfast as part of functional rehabilitation treatment program. They eat and drink together in a social dining context, providing peer support for one another. And in this particular study, this intervention was delivered over 5 days by a multidisciplinary team experienced in stroke rehabilitation. So it's a group intervention, and the how it works was a rota. So every day there would be a lead therapist rotated on to run the group, and other therapists or therapy assistants or support workers would join that individual to set up and run the breakfast groups with around between 4 to 8 patients and staff according to the acuity of the patients. So some groups had more staff than others, and it would be a real good skill mix of staff. So there were 5 components to the intervention: peer support. The patients supported each other throughout the intervention and developed really lovely relationships. Social dining and lots of conversation. In one observation, I recorded 30 different conversational topics, which were being discussed, from what was happening in Celebrity Jungle to fear of spiders to playing with conkers to car boots. The conversations were so natural and engaging. And the psychological support that was provided during that intervention, the intensity of the interventions, so the importance of it being regular and everyday, and also the involvement of team members. So you were getting speech and language therapists, physiotherapists, OTs working together with shared goals. And I'm going to now move on and tell you a little bit more about the findings from this study. So, in action, the mechanisms for rehabilitation were functional tasks. So, patients would come in, get a hot drink, prepare their own breakfast with the support of rehabilitation staff. So, they were encouraged to do as much as they could for themselves, and they were encouraged to be as independent as possible. So, everything was set up in the group so people could help themselves, a bit like you would do if you were staying in a travel lodge or a Premier Inn. You would go in and help yourself to a buffet. That's how the groups were set up. So food was available in workstations around the room, and those that could start to help themselves would be able to do that. A key factor of the mechanism for this rehabilitation intervention was repetition and practice, and the social interaction and engagement. Then there was increasing the difficulty as time went on. So over a 2-week period that patients received the intervention, they were able to increasingly do more for themselves as they were able. We also involved in opportunities for sensory stimulation, different textures, different food types. And all of this was complemented by goal orientated practice. So the completion of a daily log, setting therapeutic goals, and patients would write to evaluate themselves in their performance at the end of the session. If they weren't able to do that, someone would do it with them for them. But this became an important part of the intervention. The patients were given explicit feedback as they went along on their performance and encouraged to self-reflect on the performance. And we used strategies such as cueing, backward chaining, and motor imagery. So backward chaining is when if someone cannot complete the whole task, you start with the end element of the task, so they complete the very end of it, and the more they can do of it, the more of the task you peel back so that they're able to do it completely independent at the end of that, and getting people to visualize what they were doing before they went on to do it, which is a common rehabilitation technique. And again, focusing on this level of intensity and dose. So, how do the breakfast groups support the delivery of the National Stroke Guidelines? Well, I've produced a table for you here, which talks through that. But if you think about the guidance around a minimum of 3 hours of rehabilitation a day, then the breakfast group would take up one of those hours. And because that would have a multidisciplinary input, you might have speech and language therapists working on swallowing exercises, assessing, swallowing, and you would have other members of the disciplinary team, physio working on posture, OTs working with the upper limbs. So it really is getting everyone together around the patient, and other aspects of the intervention that touch on the guidelines are seen in the table. So the intervention was developed with a group of stakeholder uh, experts, which included patients, a carer, and NHS staff, speech and language therapists, dietitians, OTs, and physios, and a psychology assistant. And we met over 10 workshops, the final workshop being the celebratory final event workshop. But the workshops 1 to 9 were all about developing the intervention, developing a prototype intervention, and testing that intervention in 3 hospital sites. So in total, 16 patients went through the intervention study. There were 9 females and 9 males and 7 females. Majority of those patients were white British, but we had one lady that was West African and one gentleman from the Caribbean. So we had staff participating in terms of delivering the intervention. So every day of the week, it could be the same or different staff delivering the intervention, but 61 staff delivered the intervention across the 3 sites. And patients attended on average 8.6 sessions. Now, when patients didn't attend a session, that was usually attributed to a medical event or a fall, and was not attributed to the intervention itself. So there's no dropouts as a result of people not liking the breakfast group. So we did this refining process. We tested it in one hospital site and did quite a lot of refining, and then we tested it in 2 more sites. And during this testing process, myself and my primary principal investigators in the study also observed the interventions to see that they were carried out according to the protocol, but also observing any difficulties or things that we needed to be mindful for when developing the final intervention. So I'm now going to give a little deep dive into some of the findings of the Bistro study. So, acceptability and feasibility wise, I interviewed 12 stroke survivors after their period of intervention and conducted 3 focus groups with 21 staff members. I also collected some quantitative data about the outpatient outcomes for the intervention. So 15 out of the 16 participants demonstrated improved confidence with eating and drinking difficulties. Confidence gained from 5 to 44 points on the Likert scale. And I used the CASAM positive attitude subscale for optimism and self-belief, and 8 patients improved score, 5 stayed stable, and 3 showed a decline. And in the CASAM social confidence subscale, 8 improved scores, 2 stayed stable, and there was a slight decrease in 6 of the scores. Now, when we tried to understand why this might be, that there was some negative changes in the scores, this was largely attributed to the run up to Christmas and also COVID. So you'll notice in some of the photographs masks were worn. So in the early study, we were social distancing still, and as things went on, we were able to relax the measures slightly. And quite a few patients have been told that they couldn't go home for Christmas, and this really affected their confidence and morale. So those things were thought to attribute to the negative slight downturn in some of the results. and this work will be published shortly in Clinical Rehabilitation Journal. So to just go over some key points about the study. The environment was so important in this study, and there's a lovely quote from this particular participant where she talks about how the environment enabled her to feel like she could make mistakes and that it didn't matter and that everyone was in it together, and how the whole the sense of the sort of cafe dining experience really improved her outcomes. Um, from the we did a lot of things for aphasia friendly experiences, so all of the food was labeled with pictures. We had breakfast menus that were aphasia friendly, and we really did quite a lot to make sure the environment was inclusive and accessible as possible, and this made a real difference. Patients talked about it being welcoming, normal, homely, and really helped them feel more sociable and facilitated natural conversation. In terms of choice and preferences, um, we used a booklet that was co-designed as part of the intervention. This enabled us to have personalised information about eating preferences and drinking preferences, a treatment plan, goals, and a place to record strategies. And it was also the place to record the daily log and the attendance record at the group. And this created a real sense of personalisation. And you'll see in the picture that there is a nameplate in front of the patient. This one's actually been turned around to protect confidentiality, but the nameplate sits on the front, and then underneath the nameplate you can find the dietary requirements of the patient. So patients weren't asked more than once about their particular diet and their preferences around eating and drinking, and that was really valuable. In terms of cultural importance of food, it didn't come up very much in the data, and this is something that I want to dig into and more in the next study. There were some conversations about traditions as eating and culturally what different people ate for breakfast, and different routines and roles, but this wasn't a big factor in this study. Patients talked about how they'd developed across every data set, friends, relationships had matured, and patients gave lovely examples of how they were supporting each other and how their friendships had developed. And when I was observing the interventions, noticed so much laughter, real belly laughing, which was a joy to see. And also, the staff also talked about how much they enjoyed being part of breakfast group. So it was a real factor. We also found quite a lot of data around social dining and socialization, and people talking about the sense of not being alone. One of the biggest benefits they talked about was the lift in their spirits, and how being around other stroke survivors was really helping them. That sort of if they can do it, I can do it mentality. Many people were giving examples of that. Um, and there's two lovely quotes on the screen. You could argue that social dining alone is of great benefit, even if you're not doing all of the other rehabilitation aspects. And I would wholeheartedly agree that yes, it was a big factor and something to consider for future studies. But the benefits of it also being a rehabilitation intervention were really important. But some of the examples that people give about, how it had improved their mood were so um, powerful. And that's why in the next study, I want to look at more on the impact of mood of this type of intervention. But it's a very rich intervention in terms of addressing psychological and social needs. And here we have a lovely quote from a patient. So I liked that people treated me as a human being. They didn't look at me as disabled or anything like that. They encouraged me to do things. So that's what I like to do and what I got most out of it. And there were many quotes about being human, feeling human, and it being the first time that they'd felt human since the stroke. Um, so again, really powerful data. So, throughout the intervention, patients were encouraged to try out different eating aids. So there were, there's many eating aids that you can use. There's straps to make it easier to hold cutlery, spoon and plate guards, bread and butter boards. There's lots and lots of different types of adapted cutlery on the market, and also different types of cups and beakers. So it really gave people an opportunity to try out things that they might want to buy when they get home, rather than getting home, purchasing something online and then finding it's not for them. So it was a great opportunity for that. When patients were asked what they didn't like about it, there were no real negatives other than they didn't want it to end. And that was also true for staff. When I asked them about what don't you like about it, most of them said we'd like to continue doing it. And in fact, all three sites who participated in the study have continued to deliver breakfast group interventions since participation. It's now coming up to 2 years since the study. And obviously, many more units have also started breakfast groups as a result of hearing about this study. So, what did I learn? Well, I learned how important the daily log was, the importance of reflection and recording, rehabilitation, goals, and also things that people wanted to achieve was a really big part of assisting with motivation. And the whole ambience of the cafe style, lovely tablecloths, artificial flowers, napkins, it really made a difference to people's experiences. And social dining had an impact on mood, motivation, and morale. And practice and repetition really important. And people were getting that daily opportunity, and also personalization was really key. So, and the booklets help promote that. So, in all, patients talked about this really helping them and preparing them for when they go home. So, I think it's good that we can eat with other people as it prepares you for when you go home and you're meeting other people and you're going out to a restaurant and cafe bar. And lots of different stroke survivors talked about getting over the awkwardness of eating and drinking difficulties in a group of people where it's a safe, comfortable space, but also seeing other people with the same difficulties as you normalize that for individuals. Obviously, I can't say enough about the importance of the intensity and dose. It's something that we don't always do in therapy, is that regular practice. And how, one patient talked about, so, made porridge for the first time, and then she was encouraged to go on and do things for herself, and she was cutting up banana to put in a porridge, and she did things herself, and she could really see how she was doing more and more each day. And other stroke survivors talked about how they were being encouraged to try and do different things. So one day it was porridge, the next day it was toast. And because they were really thinking about, well, what do I want to do tomorrow in breakfast group? And they were making a note of that. One patient said, my mind was predestined to think about what shall I do tomorrow. And I believe this really helped the rehabilitation process. So finally, the bistro study came to an end, and we had some really positive outcomes. including finding that it was feasible and acceptable intervention for stroke survivors and staff, and the format of delivery was possible to deliver within existing resource constraints. So the next Bistro study, I am looking at further feasibility and a larger trial. And I'm also looking to introduce some technology into the intervention, working with tech partners on AI and looking at how I can use that to improve the training package for the intervention, improve the recruitment processes as well. So I'm really pleased to be able to have shared with you the results of the Bistro study today, and in fact the other work that I've done, and hope that gives you also some insights into the rehabilitation of eating and drinking difficulties from occupational therapy perspective. If you do want to ask any questions, please do get in touch. I'm sure you can have a copy of the slides, and the references are on the slides, and also my contact details are there. Thank you very much.